12 o'clock, and I'd like to welcome everybody who's joined us in this webinar. This is the first of 8 webinars we'll have over the course of the next 4 months. They are part of the Modeling Collaboratory for Subduction Research Collaboration Network. These webinars were organized by Kyle Anderson from the USGS and myself. And today we will have 2 speakers. And on Thursday we will have 2 more speakers. With your last invitation, you should have received a PDF attachment that provides a little bit of background information about the Subduction Zone 4D initiative and about the Modeling Collaboratory RCN. I'll just recap some of that here briefly before we get started. So SZ4D is a science community initiative. It's ongoing, and its objective is to investigate the processes. Apologies, I'm having trouble here with my interface. That underlie subduction zone hazards and identify produce a document for a SZ4D vision, and a preliminary document produced a couple of years ago identified a modeling collaboratory for subduction as a key component. So the Modeling Collaboratory for Subduction, MCS, is an NSF-funded research collaboration network. So that's the acronym RCN. The main goal of the MCS is to define a vision and pave the way for a modeling collaboratory for subduction through workshops. And there have already been 2 workshops. One is a fluid transport workshop in May of 2019 at the University of Minnesota. A megathrust workshop in October 2019 at the University of Oregon. Reports coming out of those workshops are available on the MCS website. And then we had planned, pretty much completed planning for a volcanic systems workshop in July 2020 at Portland. And then, well, we had a pandemic, we still are. And then Zoom. And so Zoom brings us to today. So we transferred the in-person, the Portland workshop, into a series of webinars and planning workshops, planning meetings. The first one was on eruption plumes in September 2020. And today and Thursday and Friday, we will have the crustal scale magma transport theme. So today and Thursday will be webinars. On Friday will be a planning meeting. And then there are 3 more of these themes, one in February, one in March, and one in May. Today, there will be 2 science-focused presentations. One by Tom Sisson from the USGS, and one by George Bergantz from the University of Washington. Tom will give the first talk. After the talk, there will be opportunity for participants to ask questions. Please use the Q&A tool that you will have on your interface to type in your question. After Tom's talk, we will go through as many questions as we can in sequence. Helene and Madison Myers, both speakers in future webinars, will be moderating these questions. We'll be unmuting you if you ask a question and it is your question that is being discussed, so you can follow up or add to it. After that first set of questions, George will give his talk, and then there will be more opportunity for questions. And we're planning to end this webinar at 1:30. On Thursday, we will follow the same structure with 2 talks, one by Matt Pritchard from Cornell and the other one by Matt Jackson from Imperial College of London. On Friday, we will have a planning meeting that's scheduled for 12 to 2:30 p.m. Central. Anybody interested in contributing to outlining a vision for the MCS is welcome to attend. Registration is required. For the registration, please go to the Volcano workshop webpage, which I think all of you have already visited since you registered for this webinar. The planning meeting will consist of discussions during breakout sessions and then as a whole group, as well as some report writing for those interested in participating in that. The goal is to produce a report that defines the vision for a modeling collaboratory, specifically how a modeling collaboratory would best meet the needs and leverage the opportunities for modeling and collaboration within volcanic system science. So I'd like to emphasize it's not just about modeling or numerical modeling, it's about collaboration and modeling. The report will be produced, we'll do it in pieces, right? There will be 4 more of these themes, and at the end will be a report, but each theme there will be a preliminary report that will grow over the months into this final report. And that's all I have in terms of introduction, and I'll give it to Kyle.
Yeah, so it's my pleasure to introduce Tom Sisson. Tom is a geologist at the US Geological Survey. He's done a remarkably wide range of work in the fields of experimental petrology, geochemistry, volcanology, and field geology. He's particularly known for his work on magma differentiation, the role of water in magmas, generation of batholiths, ocean island magmatism at Kilauea, and the geology and hazards of Cascade volcanoes with a particular focus on Mount Rainier, where he's really considered kind of the world's expert. Today, Tom is going to be presenting on an introduction to the crustal structure of arc magmatic systems with some current issues amenable for modeling. Tom?
Thank you. Let's see. I will share the screen and share that. Is this working? Somebody give me some feedback.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm not a modeler. I do very simplistic modeling, but I do a lot of field work, as Kyle said. And my role in this series of lectures is setting the stage for people like George and Matt, so they don't have to cover some of the basic ground. So I will be talking about the crustal structure of arc magmatic systems, a combination of volcanic and plutonics, with just a few pointers for some things that I think would be useful for modeling. So here are a couple of observed crustal sections through magmatic arcs. On the left is the Sierra Nevada. This is Jason Salibi's cartoon version of it, but it's observed down to about depths of equivalent to about 30 kilometers in the Tehachapies. And then in the center is the Kohistan crustal section. And this is actually exposed all the way down. I should say the deeper portion of Jason's section is based on xenoliths carried up in tertiary volcanic rocks. And there's some strong similarities between them. There are what I've called ordinary Plutons that extend down to about 30 to 35 kilometers depth. And what do I mean by ordinary? I mean tonalite, granodiorite, granite Plutons. They've got widths of kilometers, commonly 5 to 10 kilometers across. They're characteristically steep-sided, as far down as we can see in the Sierra Nevada. We don't see very many Pluton floors, or things that are at least unambiguously Pluton floors. And while there are dikes, the dikes tend to be very late stage, aplites and pegmatites. And then deeper than the Plutons, I've lost my cursor. There it is, it's back. So deeper than the ordinary Plutons, in both arcs you get into a diversity of different kinds of mafic rocks. In Coistan, the deeper members of those are calculated as being density unstable, and if they had been given the opportunity, they would have fallen off into the mantle. And then on the right, I show one of many modeling approaches to arc magmatic sections. And you'll notice that they look pretty different. And to be fair, you have to walk before you can run. So ultimately, we would like to have models that go, boy, this is hard with the cursor going with the, that go from this to this or this. Now, the arc sections lead to concepts like this. Pretty simple. Primitive magmas stall in or at the lower crust, and they differentiate down there. They undergo partial melting of the crust. Evolved magmas rise, and cumulates are lost to the mantle. But there are problematic details that I'll get to in a moment. But can we develop models in which primitive magmas naturally stall in the deep crust and that mature into observed arc sections? And over how long does this take? And some of the things that we need to know to make progress on this are the aperture of the magmatic feeding system. That is, what is this dimension down here? And what is the temperature in the deep crust? And what is the continuity of the magmatic system? Where do the intrusions store or stall? And what is the overall magmatic flux? So some of the problems, as Kyle said, I do experimental work, and a number of laboratories, mine, MIT, ETH Zurich, have recently been doing experiments on hydrous arc basalts under oxidized deep crustal conditions. And one of the results that you come up with is that it takes a lot of crystallization differentiation to get the liquid into the field of the silica content of bulk continental crust or common andesites and dacites. So for reference, the solid fields are a couple of dry, well-studied magmatic systems, Thingmule in Iceland and Kilauea Iki in Hawaii. These are what would be called tholeiitic systems. And then the various symbols are different experimental studies that have been performed. And even the most advantageous under deep crustal conditions, it takes about 50% crystallization differentiation to produce a liquid that looks like bulk continental crust. And that means that to make bulk continental crust or common andesites and dacites in arcs, you've got to get rid of about half of the mass of the material. And that's a problem. Now, we all like to say that delamination is the explanation. It probably is, but actually getting a better handle on how that happens is an important, outstanding problem. So another one that's come up is that every lab that has studied deep crustal differentiation has found that the andesitic liquids become what petrologists call paraluminous. And that's dissimilar to natural arc volcanic and plutonic rocks. So this black line here shows a generalized liquid line of descent at deep crustal conditions, whereas the colored shading shows actual volcanic rocks from continental margin arcs. And you can see that they're actually pretty different. Now, we experimentalists are still arguing about what this is. My hunch is that entrainment of evolved components during fractionation will probably resolve this disparity. And that just says that the systems are more complicated than deep basaltic magmas undergoing Bowen-style crystallization differentiation. One of the things that we learned from studying actual arc volcanoes, and I'll get to it in a moment, in Plutons, is that the systems are long-lived and relatively immobile. And that means that later magmas are mainly transiting antecedent intrusions of the same magmatic system. We also find again and again that growth is pulsed. Major stages of volcano growth are on the order of 10,000 to 100,000 years. Single edifices, and I'm talking about arc stratovolcanoes, have durations of on the order of 500,000 to 1 million years. And then commonly, today's volcanoes are sitting on top of the eroded relics of ancestral volcanoes. And so it's often hard to determine the inception of the ancestral volcano because it's mostly gone or concealed, but ballpark on the order of 1 to 2 million years for both the active and the ancestral volcano. And the important thing is we don't really know why they're pulsed. It really hasn't received a lot of attention from the modeling community or even from the petrologic community. This is mainly an observation that field geologists make. So as George suggested that I also bring to your attention, there are even longer lived systems, say 5 to 10 million years. And these very commonly mature towards voluminous evolved magmas after incubations of about 3 to 6 million years. So here are various different examples: age versus cumulative volume. This is Anita Grunder's compilation with different rock types, mafic to felsic. And you can see that a handful to say 5 or 6 million years passes, and then substantial outpourings of dacite or rhyodacite and rhyolite come out. We don't know why this happens. It's a solid observation that we've actually known for much longer from arc intrusive suites. So here's an example from where I've worked. This is the Whitney intrusive suite. This is a twin or a sister, both in rock type, rock composition and texture and age, to the much more well-known Tuolumne intrusive suite further north in the Sierra Nevada. And to give you a sense of scale, this is about 70 kilometers overall length. So it's similar, say, to the dimensions of the Toba caldera. And it starts out as dark granodiorite, the Sugarloaf, Lone Pine Creek on the opposite side at about 87 million years, followed by the Paradise. And so the equivalent of this in Tuolumne would be the Kuna Crest. The Paradise, its equivalent would be the Half Dome. And then the Whitney, which is its equivalent, is the Cathedral Peak. So it has the same large K feldspar megacrust. So in some cases, the younger members of these zoned intrusive suites have greater complements of crustal components, but in other cases, they don't. So the felsic younger trends, to my thinking, probably reflect overall declining magmatic temperatures. But why would the more felsic younger magmas, lower temperature magmas, also be more voluminous? So there's another question for some of you to think about. And to full disclosure, there are exceptions to this rule. Now, another advance that has come about in really the last decade or so is that it's become possible to determine the fine scale growth and solidification of arc intrusions. And this is an example I particularly like. This is work that Blair Shoney did when he was postdocing with Urs Schaltiger in Geneva. And it's the Lago de la Vaca intrusion at the southwestern end of the Adamello batholith in the Alps. And what I'm showing here is a succession of rock types that geologists had mapped, and they knew from the geologic relations that it was older to younger, and it was more mafic. So these are hornblende gabbros, a few ultramafic rocks, quartz diorites, and then moving into quartz diorites and tonalites, and then tonalites, and then granodiorites. So the oldest of these is about 42, just slightly over 42 million years. And then moving progressively inward, what I've plotted is the age in thousands of years relative to that initial inception. So this is 5,000 years younger, but with enough uncertainty that maybe it's the same age. But then you get into the tonalite and it's 85,000 years younger, 175,000 years younger, 215,000 years younger. And then finally, in the core granodiorite, it's 300,000 years younger than the initial mafic rocks of the intrusion. Now, the geologists, this place has been studied like crazy because it's beautifully exposed, and there's a wonderful hut right about here on Lago de la Vaca. The geologists who studied both the Plutons and the metamorphic rocks interpret this as having ballooned or expanded out to the southeast. So that's about 3 kilometers of expansion in 300,000 years, or about a centimeter per year. So it's becoming possible to actually clock the rates of expansion of intrusions, at least in the tertiary, where the uncertainties on the age measurements are small enough. Now, we all know this, magma mixing and mingling are nearly ubiquitous in arc, intrusive, and volcanic rocks. But there's some curious things, like that the mafic enclaves are typically no larger than lime to grapefruit sized. Well, what controls this? And then the abundances that you see in a particular volcano or in a particular Pluton particularly tend to be characteristic of the systems. So here are a couple of examples. On the right, this is an ice-chilled dacite on Glacier Peak Volcano in Washington State. And unlike the common situation, the mafic enclaves are actually lighter colored than their host because they're porous, whereas the host material is, as I said, ice quenched, so it's dark. That's a lot of mafic inclusions, but it's common for Glacier Peak. Not every flow is like this, but you run across enough flows that it becomes routine. And this is an example from the Sierra Nevada, the granodiorite of Castle Creek. That's not particularly important, but this Pluton and many other Plutons just go on and on like this for miles and miles with similar abundances of mafic inclusions that tends to be associated with the color index or the mafic mineral content of the rock. We don't know why. Now, there are a number of localities where people have recognized exposed mafic underplating. And what one characteristically sees are sheeted sill complexes. So this is a photograph of a single hornblende gabbro sill. There's a pencil here for scale. It's finer grained at its margins, and characteristically, these are separated by little septa of trapped mush. This is another hornblende gabbro sill here. You don't always see upward Younging relations in these things, as you would expect if the mafic injections were flowing out like, say, magmatic lava flows within a resident granitic magma. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you see that a lower sill is actually younger than the overlying material. So it's complicated, but this is the characteristic behavior of these things. These little septa have upward magma escape structures. You can see them starting to form here and here. This is the more buoyant trapped material trying to get out. And then when the sills get thicker, they start segregating internally. So this, for example, is the incipient segregation within that sill. And then if the sills get greater than about 10 meters thick, they start forming really nicely developed cumulates. This is an example on the right. The relief in this cumulate section is about 200 meters, and it's overlain and laterally continuous with sheeted sills. Now, more often than not, we don't actually find these mafic underplates at the bottoms of intrusions. What we find is that they're somewhere that can be interpreted as an interface between more melt-rich material and more crystal-rich material. So they are density trapping, but they're not necessarily or even routinely density trapping at the actual bottom of the intrusion. Now, sometimes what comes up goes back down. So hydrous mafic magmas in arcs are pretty low density. Say even a basalt, once it's got 6% water in it, it's not very dense. It's in fact more buoyant than granitic or granodioritic crystal mush, but when it solidifies, its density goes back up. So here's a ring complex in the southern Sierra Nevada. It's about 8 kilometers in this dimension by about 6 kilometers in that dimension. It consists of granite, that's the light colored resistant material, and hornblende gabbro, these are the dark recessive materials. these are sheeted sills. You can see the foliations in the dip in the mafic sheets with these three little teeth, cumulus layering with a standard strike and dip, and then just foliation. Now, the curious thing is that the mafic sheets aren't horizontal. So here are some of those magma escape structures, but they're not pointing up, they're pointing in towards the center of the intrusion. Here are the contacts of some of the sills. That's a sill contact there, there's a sill contact there, there's a sill contact there. They're not horizontal. They're also dipping in towards the interior of the intrusion. What that means is that these sills have been tilted. And so at the bottom here, I have a cartoon. So there's a mushy granite magma body. It gets invaded by hydrous basalt and spreads out as sheeted sills. And then as those solidify and their density increases, they sink back down and the sills become rotated, forming a ring complex. Now, getting into a little bit of geochemistry, what's observed again and again in arc andesitic stratovolcanoes is that the compositional excursions tend to be brief. So on the left, I have 500,000 years of history from Mount Rainier plotted against whole rock zirconium. Not all these rocks have been dated. What I've done is forced myself to put things in stratigraphic sequence and estimate ages of undated samples by bracketing dated samples. What you can see, though, is that the excursions to anomalous compositions are brief. They're about at the resolution of the geology and geochronology. And on the right, here's much finer. This is actually years before present, and it's constrained by both carbon-14 and paleomag. And this is the strontium concentration in plagioclase measured by electron microprobe. And what you see is that there's an excursion to high strontium and then a reversion back to normal strontium for Mount Rainier. And it's only on the order of about 200 years or perhaps less. And this is backed up by whole rock geochemistry as well that shows this high strontium and then reversion to normal strontium. And that's consistent with the active portions of the system being relatively small. You know, what does small mean? I throw that out again to the modeling community to answer or to work on that question. Cold storage is a term that's passed around a lot now. My personal opinion is that it's an end member of a spectrum of behaviors. On the left, I show an arc tholite system I worked on. This is Benjaminov caldera in Alaska. And it behaves, it's large, it's fast grown, arc tholite, and it does about what you would expect for crystallization differentiation, repeatedly, but with somewhat differing parent magma compositions. So say a lower phosphorus parent magma would fractionate until it reaches apatite saturation and then slide down the apatite saturation surface. And the higher phosphorus one would come up here and go down like that. And then in contrast, on the right is Mount Rainier. It's a medium-sized calc-alkaline stratovolcano, and it has much more evidence, macroscopic and petrographic, for mixing and mingling, incorporation of evolved components, consistent with a system that's being heated, cooled, heated, cooled, heated, cooled. So it depends on magma flux, among other things. Volatiles. I could talk for an hour about volatiles, but I don't have that much time. So the parent magmas coming into arc systems are water rich. And one of the things that does in a magma is it allows it to have significant fractions of melt to relatively low temperatures. The last 10 years or so, I've been doing a lot of work in intraplate volcanism in actually Arabia. And those are dry magmas. And fractionating from alkali basalt all the way to trachyte, we see no more than about 5% crustal incorporation, whereas in arc systems, it's typically much more. So partly that's due to the water allowing melt to persist to low temperatures. Partly it's due to the released aqueous fluids promoting melting of wall rocks and remelting of antecedent intrusions. As differentiation is taking place in the deep crust, some of these volatiles work their way up the system. So the compositions of the plumes that come out are actually composites. And then it's also important for interpreting deformation signals. We see, say, a deformation signal on an arc volcano. And it would be nice if we could interpret that in terms of the volume of replenishing magma. But a complication is that the arc intrusions become compressible because they have bubbles in them. So we don't really know whether a certain inflation or deflation is caused by a particular volume increase and decrease of replenishing or exiting magma, or if it's simply the wall rocks being spongy. Now, something I'm working on right now with John Power and Matt Haney at the Alaska Volcano Observatory is reinterpreting deep crustal seismicity in arc magmatic systems to see if we can start coming up with some independent evidence for the dimensions of the active portions in the deep crust. So the deep seismicity is characteristically been interpreted as pathways of magma feeding. So here's an example from Mount St. Helens, deep long period events feeding up into a shallow reservoir. Here's Mammoth, basaltic injections creating deep long period events. You notice in both cases, they're not actually underneath the volcano. I've always been suspicious of this. So looking at deep crustal seismicity in aggregate, so here's 11,000 events from Japan. Here's 2,300 events from the Aleutians. What's plotted is depth beneath the nearest volcano versus radial distance. What you can see is that the deep seismic events flare out when you get into the middle and lower crust. So there's a relatively quiet zone that's actually directly beneath the volcano. This is what we were seeing in the preceding slide with the deep events being off to the side, not actually underneath the volcano. Well, I think a simple interpretation of this is that this quiet zone is actually where most of the action is happening for magmas entering and moving up into the system. And it's quiet simply because it's too hot and plastic. And then moving outward from that, we get into a seismogenic halo. It's simply cooler. And so here's a cartoon. Here's the more active portion. Out in fluids or residual melts make their way out into the cooler margins. They promote fluid enhanced embrittlement, creating seismicity, which might be recorded in the geologic record as things like deep aplite dikes. If that's correct, then the active portion here or here in the deep crust has a radius of only on the order of about 5 kilometers. And these are mostly arc stratovolcanoes. Anyway, to bring this to a conclusion, this is my preferred view for a cross section between an ordinary arc stratovolcano. Batholithic scale systems would be much larger, but the relatively narrow zone in which basaltic magmas are entering the deep crust and undergoing crystallization differentiation. Over most of the history of the volcano, they're running into and working their way through earlier intrusions from the same magmatic system. As they do so, they're picking up evolved components from those earlier intrusions. They're getting stalled at different levels and differentiating. And at times, less evolved magmas do a flank bypass, and we see them as peripheral mafic events. So to finalize, some goals. We'd like to get to having models that evolve to real-looking arc sections. And these would include steep-sided, tabular, intermediate plutons in the middle and upper crust, with primitive cumulates deep and mostly gone. We have to get rid of them. Plutons are larger than the active portions of magmatic systems at particular moments in time. We ought to be able to distinguish these. Why are the systems pulsed? And then the reason that the taxpayer actually gives us money to do this is to make their lives safer and better. So we want to understand the structure of the deep magmatic systems so that we can detect magma sooner and interpret monitoring signals more accurately. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That was great. So we are starting to get questions. Just a reminder to all participants, if you would like to ask a question, please type it in under your Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom session. And Madison and Helen will call out your name and we will unmute you as your question is being read.
So we have a question to start with from Terry Plank. She's asking, I was intrigued by the comparison between Benny and Rainier. Were these data sets over similar timescales? What do you think drives the contrast?
They are over similar timescales. Actually, Rainier is about 500,000 years of history. Benny is about 350,000 years of history. Benny is a more mafic system, and it grew faster. It had a very rapid early growth period. So I think, and it's a caldera system. So more mafic magma is making it to a shallower level in the crust there, and it's undergoing more what we would consider, petrology 1 crystallization differentiation. It's doing it over and over and over again, but it's a hotter system, hotter, more vigorous system.
And is that because there's a higher magma flux?
Yes.
Wait, okay. So if you were a modeler, you'd be turning the magma flux dial and seeing if.
Yeah, you'd be turning. That would be the dial. You would turn it up into the red zone. You turn it to 11.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay, I'll do the next question. We have one from Diana Roman. Does the pulsing of eruption volume appear to correspond to any larger scale changes in plate convergence or other tectonic processes?
I think that's really interesting possibility. I looked hard at the repulses in Rainier, the periods of rapid growth and the periods of greater quiescence, expecting to find some kind of petrologic association, and I came up with nothing. So I would like it if the volcanoes were in some way tectonically throttled, that we were seeing some kind of tectonic control on the output of the system. So there were periods of, say, some tens of thousands of years to 100,000 years in which the valve is spun open a little more, and then other periods in which the valve is more tightly closed. But I don't know any way of corroborating that. So I'm not aware of anything. It's a hard time scale. When people are, say, doing fault recurrence, they're looking at hundreds to thousands of years. And when people are looking at plate motions, they're looking at millions of years. But that hundreds of thousands to a few million years, there are not many tools that you can use to interrogate tectonic activity.
Thanks so much, Tom. That was a really interesting and thoughtful answer.
Thanks.
Next, Karen Bemis is asking, how do you think smaller one-off eruption volcanoes fit into this system? For example, the so-called monogenetic volcanoes.
Well, I think what we rarely see are the inception stages of these large magmatic systems, or if we see them, we don't recognize them as such. So it may be that the so-called monogenetic, some of the monogenetic centers actually aren't monogenetic. They're just a system getting started. But they tend to be more mafic. I think that the crust is relatively cold, so the magma transport is closer to dominantly by dikes. So I mean that's about all I can say on it.
All right.
The other, I see there's a few more numbers there.
Oh, there's definitely more. I was
yeah.
just seeing if Karen wanted to say anything, but I guess moving on to Mara Arts. Thank you for your talk. I might have missed it, but why do younger magmas in a system have lower temperatures?
There's a nice question. I don't have an explanation for that. Well, okay. I look at those long-lived intrusive systems as as waxing and waning. And to get things to start being preserved as Plutons, you're on the waning limb of the magmatic event. And so it wouldn't be surprising that as time passes, the overall magma temperature falls. The question though is in what way does this relate to volume? I mean, we seem to see both in the volcanic systems and the plutonic systems that commonly the younger felsic things are pretty big. And you really wouldn't, at least initially, expect that if you're on the waning limb of a magmatic event, a magmatic pulse. I put it out there because it's something that could use some attention.
Next, Leif Karlstrom, great talk, Tom. Where would you look for plutonic evidence for the brittle ductile transition in mature arc systems, perhaps at different stages in their lifetimes? For example, where should SZ4D experiments focus?
Ductile transition. Well, I think it's going to depend on the overall magmatic flux and the maturity of the system. It's going to be deeper in the Cascades, which is a desultory arc, and much shallower in the Andes, in the high Andes. It's much more vigorous arc. But specifically where to do an experiment, I think that's something for more people to weigh in on.
I guess as a follow-up to that, do you think it's just flux or is it duration as well?
It's both.
Yeah.
I tend to think those things tend to go together, but maybe that's being too simplistic.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question comes from Luca Carici. Is it possible that period of higher volcanic activity just reflects thermal maturity of the plumbing system and no changes of magma input from the mantle?
Would you say that again?
Ooh, a reread. Okay. Is it possible that that periods of higher volcanic activity just reflect thermal maturity of the plumbing system and not changes of magma input from the mantle?
Yeah, but you got to make the system die, right? So in the zoned Plutons, I mean, you don't know in the volcanic systems more often than, and if they're still active, you don't know is the thing dead or not. But in the plutonic systems, you're reasonably certain that the last Pluton is the last Pluton. So they are dying. So I think that correlation is pretty strong, that there's something going on that the system is being turned off. But I completely will accept the possibility that the reason we're seeing more voluminous felsic magmas later in the system has to do with, in some way, maturation of the system. So it's easier for them to get up to the surface. But this is more of a George question than a Tom question.
Another question from Cynthia Ebinger. Can you clarify that cumulate volumes are so low and thin to be undetected with geophysical tools?
I don't think that they're, well, cumulates at the base of the crust or cumulates at high levels?
Cindy?
High levels. Hey, Tom.
High levels. I think one of the things that we learned from the iMush experiment is that we're kind of pushing the resolution of the method. The Mount St. Helens system is pretty narrow. So my personal opinion is that iMush told us an awful lot about the crustal structure in that portion of the Cascades, but it doesn't quite have the resolution to see the sorts of things that we were hoping to see. Now, I know there's a serious effort happening now on Santorini, and they may do better. They may learn from our experience. I'm sure they will. That's how science works. But I think right now, it would be tough to resolve cumulate bodies, but you know, it's not my field. So prove me wrong.
No, what I meant was in the outcrop, are there examples of dimensions that you could quote for the thickness of those sheeted cells? And,
oh yeah. I mean, so but more usually you see the top of the thing, but you don't see the bottom of the sheeted cell complex. You see the bottom of the sheeted cell complex, but yet the top's been being eroded away. That's just the nature of field geology. But yeah, there are places where one could do this. The best exposures in my experience tend to be in national park wilderness areas. And so that's just a nightmare to try to get any kind of permission to do on the ground geophysics. But you know, there are probably other places in the world, not in the United States, that are less persnickety about disturbing marmots.
Okay, our next question comes from Patricia Moss. Have you seen pulsing at several neighboring volcanoes that seem to have occurred at the same time? This could be a lead to tracing tectonic geodynamic forcings.
Not at high resolution, but it is true that many of the Cascade volcanoes, the currently active Cascade volcanoes, lit up somewhere between, say, 600 and 400,000 years ago. Andy Calvert has compiled all the information. That he's an Argonne geochronologist here at the USGS and has been dating up and down the Cascades. There really does seem to be that the candle was lit about 500,000 years ago, and we don't know why. But those are also sitting on top of deeply dissected ancestral volcanoes. But on terms of a fine scale, not really. And in part, that's because the methods from the earlier studies aren't as good as they are now. So say the first place that this pulsing was shown in the Cascades was Mount Adams, and that was all potassium argon work that Marvin Lanphier did with Wes Hildreth. And it just doesn't have the precision of the 4039 results that we can do now. So one could profitably reinvestigate some of this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
So this is probably going to be the last question for now from Don De Paolo. It's more of a comment regarding silicic volumes versus primitive basalts. It helps to have isotopic data to have a value for crustal mantle components. For Eastern Sierra, the volume of granodiorite could be larger than the amount of starting basalt due to crustal melting, what I call lower crustal magma supply amplification. Large volume granitoids and large volume rhyolite systems probably don't form where there is no pre-existing silicic crust. Do you have a comment?
There are silicic calderas out in the Aleutians. They're not terribly far out in the Aleutians, but I don't deny any of that.
Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, the Sierra is the Sierra. I mean, I think the Eastern Sierra probably had pretty thick and silicic crust before the Cretaceous magma started to form. So what you see there is very interesting, but I think what it's telling you is that when you have a lot of silicic crust and you add basalt to it, you get a lot of mixing of that basalt with the pre-existing silicic crust. And you got a lot of intermediate composition magmas coming out of that. But it's largely mixing happening in the lower crust, I think.
Then you're maficizing the continent.
Yes, definitely.
You're maficizing the continent then, and so as a sort of a continental growth process, you're going in the wrong direction.
Well, I agree. You have to start somewhere. But unfortunately, there you already have Proterozoic crust that's being intruded. Right. So it's not going to tell you the whole story of how you made the Proterozoic crust. you have to look in Arizona for that, but you probably thought of that.
Yeah.
All right, so I think, unfortunately, for reasons of time, we'll need to move on. But as a reminder, there will be an opportunity for some additional discussion at the end of the webinar today. So thanks again, Tom. So it's my pleasure to introduce George Bergantz. George earned his PhD from Johns Hopkins, and he's currently professor at the University of Washington. George uses numerical modeling, lab experiments, and field studies really from all around the world to quantitatively examine melt generation, extraction, transport, and storage, and also the life cycle of volcanic systems. This includes some really interesting work on the physical and microphysical processes of mushy crystal-rich systems. Today, George is going to be presenting on making sense of mush, the geology, physics, and chemistry of magmatic systems. George?
Thank you, Kyle. I'll start sharing my screen now. And let's do this. Okay. I'm going to get my laser pointer out here. This is the Volcanic Systems Modeling Workshop. As you know, day one, we were asked to talk about aspects of crustal scale magma transport. We were charged with overviewing opportunities with an eye towards collaboration, not just among modelers, but throughout the entire effort of the Volcano systems community. We were encouraged not to talk about our latest and greatest work, and so much of the work I'm going to present today is not especially new, whether it's from my group. That also means I wasn't able to share some of the really exciting research that's coming out of other modeling groups, so I apologize to them in advance, and I hope somehow in this process of these workshops and discussions and so on, you all get a chance to share with us the exciting things you're doing. The theme here is looking at mush. As we know, this notion of magma systems as being mushy has been something of a paradigm shift and presents new challenges for trying to explain the really, the great diversity of petrologic processes that we see from mixing to melt extraction and so on. Today, I'm going to focus on this idea of how do we improve our understanding of the physics and chemistry of mushy systems and the controls that go on. And we're going to look at some rocks, we're going to look at some modeling ideas, and then ask ourselves, how can we combine these in a way that it creates a real advance? I'm going to just take a moment to thank my collaborators. I've had many great collaborators in my life, and I feel very fortunate. The team I'm working with right now includes my longtime friend, Dr. Alain Bergesser, who's at the CNRS in Chambéry, Dr. Alex Carrera, who's a postdoc here at the University of Washington, and Professor Laurent Auberet, who is at the CNRS and the University of Orléans. And together we have this joint NSF French project on mush dynamics called Mush. And so stay tuned for a lot more work to come out of this collaboration. Our efforts in trying to do anything in natural science usually kind of involves at least 3 steps. And the first is data collection. The second is looking at that data and trying to organize it in a way that illuminates some interesting features and differentiates things about the data, but itself doesn't actually kind of graduate to the level of being knowledge. That's still something that lives in an Excel spreadsheet. And I think our community is very good at doing data and information, and I think that we can aspire to do more to kind of upgrade our Excel spreadsheets into something that is more of a knowledge-based product where we can make predictions, where we can look at the things that come out of our data and information and understand why certain time scales and length scales emerge over and over again. And our magmatic systems are a good venue for that. So for example, from my own career here in the data, here we are in Kilauea, working on the Mauna Loa lava flows with Pete Lippman, Mike Garcia, Frank Truesdale, and my former amazing graduate student, Jill Schleicher. So here we are just gathering samples. If you want to elevate that to being information, you can either, do geochemistry on it. And here's the classic geochemist cake, where you have some element divided by another element relative to some random element and some other unknown element. And you sprinkle your data around on that and see what you find. I'm teasing, of course. Or you can do a diffusion study like this very nice one here and extract a time scale. But that time scale is still a kinematic quantity. You can fill spreadsheets with time scales, but that information on its own doesn't really elevate us yet to the kind of level of knowledge. Someone like me can come along and make a numerical model that attempts to try and integrate some of these things, but typically it's done in a fashion that doesn't really emerge organically from the data gathering side, and so is also inhibited as a real vehicle for extension of our results. What we're aiming to do with this collaboration concept is to really revisit how can we marry these efforts in a more natural way. And so the geologists can ask hard questions of the modelers. What have you done to really assess and understand the assumptions that are going into this so that I can rely on the inferences that it produces? And the modelers can turn and ask hard questions of the geologists and say, how much confidence should I have in the fact I have 3 age dates for a 200,000 kilometer magmatic system? What does that even mean? What's the statistical significance of that? And so, we need to ask each other harder questions and think more outside the box. And that's kind of where I hope this collaboration is going to be taking us. Now, the real jet engine of creating knowledge is, of course, the people and the human resources. And I have to say, in my over 30 years in my career, I've never been more excited about the new tools we have, and we'll talk about those in a minute, but also about the extraordinary talent that is now available and coming into the field. And I was able to interact with many of these remarkable people at the CIDR meeting back in 2019. And here's the group. Here's some of them right here. And but wait a minute. Who's this guy? I can't get to Bernie because of the, hang on here. Yeah, one more try. Well, anyway, Bernie made a showing. But anyway, my point only was that we're at a really exciting juncture because of the advent of microanalytical and microtextual analyses in a way that has never been available before, combined with an extraordinary group of young scientists who are really, producing amazing work. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Let's look at a little bit at the scales of observations that one might want to, that kind of motivate a certain modeling approach and that really kind of call out, as Tom mentioned, a great variety of them. With regard to, living magmatic systems, the Altiplano Pluna magma body, this wonderful paper by Ward, this thing is, 200,000 cubic kilometers. I think that's right, of up to 25% melt. It's an enormous, it's 11 kilometers thick body imaged in real time geophysically. Tom outlined some of the things we know about crustal sections. The crust is not a blank slate. We know from the work at Talkeetna, we know from Coastam, we know from the Sierra, we know from the Pomatinian crust, and they have remarkable agreement in the main elements of their geological anatomy. And when we look at those in more detail, and Tom provided some examples, and here I am in front of an outcrop in Tuolumne Meadows, the plutonic systems themselves carry a lot of information about the nature of the dynamics, even though, of course, they don't, they are the frozen last remnants. They are still full of signal. In addition, we can really see how melts are moving. Someone asked about the cumulus. I'm going to take you on a field trip here shortly, a very quick one. We're going to go down and look at the deep mafic roots of an arc. We're going to look at the different expressions of melt transport and ask ourselves, how might we model that and understand it as a process to get a better handle on what are the time scales that control this. Point being, we do have a tremendous amount of information, but the really exciting stuff, in my view, what's really driving the science right now, are the microscale observations. The microscale observations being, say, for like this is a melt-bearing xenolith from the Galapagos. Dr. Dennis Geis gave me this image, and it's discussed in a really nice paper by Holness et al. In 2018. But the point is, we can now make element maps. This image contains information about texture, grain size, grain fabric, composition, all simultaneously. And learning to work with these kinds of images, if you will, or these kinds of samples, melt bearing. So this was a living mush, enables us to better understand the controls on the mushy magmatic systems. In addition, the advent of microanalysis, digging down at the crystal scale, reveals tremendous complexity. What we learn from that is these mushes wax and wane. You can have a mush like this one shown here in the Galapagos xenolith becoming completely dispersed, that mush reforming as a compact collection of granular objects, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of heartbeat in the magmatic system that is preserved in the crystal cargo. So once again, we have a very, very rich set of data to motivate us to really understand things that, you know, even 10 years ago were very, very difficult to do routinely. We can also extract time scales now from diffusion experiments, and so pulling time in, once again, by microanalytical techniques. Not to mention melt inclusion work and so on. I'm going to talk about volatiles because this is really about magma transport. People later in the modeling collaboratory will talk about the upper crustal parts. But the point only being the microscale observations, including the use of EBSD to evaluate texture, shape preferred orientation, and crystal preferred orientation, marrying EBSD back into the microscale geochemistry and timescales is producing a network of information that is really crying out for modeling. But the modeling can't be simple. In addition, there have been technical and theoretical advances. By technical advances, I mean that, like this image over here, where we have this is an image from a Patterson rig experiment done in Orléans. You can look at crystal fabric evolution. You can look at deformation styles between distributed to localized deformation, what triggers the two, and so on. There have been significant advances in the physics and theory of granular materials. This has made, this has become very important in earthquake mechanics, in surface processes, and as we are trying to develop now in the context of magmatic systems, understanding mush. So it's called soft matter in physics, but it actually has tremendous power of explanation, as we'll see when we look at geological examples. There's been advances in modeling technology, and I'll give you an example of that, where we can now run models where we actually follow a particle at the crystal scale. There's a number of groups doing this around the country now, each of them approaching it a little differently. But the point is, we can start to create models that are responding to the opportunities that are flowing out of the micro scale measurement work. And this is what I meant when I said this is the most exciting time in my career, between the incredible talent, the microscale observations, and finally models that can actually address observations at that scale, whether it's crystal zoning, whether it's trying to build understand better the statistical significance of crystal populations and what we see, and so on. So all these things together shape the notion of opportunities with regard to the idea of a modeling collaboratory going forward. What I want to do now is return to magma transport, because that's what we're talking about today, and just share with you an example of the diversities that we see when we go into the deep arc crust, and then ask ourselves, what is a modeling approach that is appropriate given the geologic complexity that we see. And I'm going to start with this outcrop shot here. Here's an Argentine peso. This is from this is about 8 kilobars, which is considered deep in this arc in Famatina, Ordovician arc in Western Argentina, where we have a large part of the mafic mothership preserved there. And here, so what do we see in this outcrop? This is not a migmatite. This is an amphibole gabbronorite. All the darker patches are amphibole gabbronorite, and you can see there's islands that are pretty much purely cumulate. And moving around in between them, you can see stringers. This is tonalite melt. This is a K-pore tonalite melt that is exactly the melt that would be in equilibrium with these amphibole gabbronorites. And here we can see the very interesting, in one outcrop, diversity of ways in which that melt is organizing and moving through a material that itself is rheologically quite heterogeneous. Portions that have already lost melt are now acting as almost locked rigid bodies. Other places that still have some melt in them are responding ductily. Point being, this is what it looks like when you actually have the opportunity to see it in the field. Here's some more examples. You can see tonalite domains starting to organize around their parent cumulate bodies. These, you would normally think these are enclaves perhaps, but these aren't. These are, if you drill these and you measure the chemistry, these are cumulates. These are, and here you can see again the way in which the interstitial tonalite melt is organizing a drainage network. It's reminiscent of migmatites in that it's a progressive network forming process, but these are not migmatites, and there are some important differences. Let me just mention one from the modeling standpoint. Chemically, melting a rock and crystallizing it has been shown to be pretty much the same, but mechanically it's not. The way that the crystal contact network evolves, going up temperature and down temperature, leaves you with a very different way, a crystal strength network, and we'll talk about those networks in a minute. Here we see in this final picture yet another expression of the way that cumulates and melts are self-organizing each other and ultimately producing a canonical tonalic mid-crust that you can go to this place and you can go to the field and you can see these melts leaving their cumulates and migrating into right there the mid-crust. It's a rather spectacular location. A couple of last figures here. Once again, you can see these tonalitic melts gathering up and migrating out. Occasionally they form channels and they will actually pass through, as Tom was saying, antecedents. Here we can see in this photograph the whiter gray material is tonalite. These darker patches, this is a cumulate that's being pushed around and pushed aside by the passage of tonalites. Here you can see it again. Here's a piece of cumulate where my lasered point is. These white stringers are melt seams that are back invading basically their own cumulate. So what do we see when we go to the field? We see tonalite extraction. We see tonalite back invading and mixing with its basically its own parent cumulates. And this is what it looks like when you actually go to the field. And when we think about our modeling, this is the kind of complexity we have to at least acknowledge, even if we're not going to address it. We have to acknowledge that whatever approach we take has some verisimilitude to the natural process. In addition, when you look at plutonic rocks, this is a very nice paper from Alessino and Geosphere from last year or a couple of years ago. We see remarkable rheological transitions in almost the same outcrop. Over here on the left, we have what are called melt-present faults. And I know Scott Patterson and Valley Mehmeti and others have told me they see these quite commonly in the Sierra. You can see the offsets here. There are abrupt truncations and so on. What this is telling us is that the behavior of this mush is not simple. It isn't a simple kind of on-off type or locked, unlocked kind of system. Because right next door or very nearby, you have places where you have ductile behavior, you have almost soft folding of strongly mushy material. So the point of this slide is simply to remind us that whatever models we want to invoke for describing mushy materials, we have to be sure to capture the natural rheological complexity without over-prescribing it just for the sake of simplicity. Or if we do, have a clear understanding of what we're giving up by doing that in terms of having the power of explanation. So, if I was to just summarize some points from those field shots, I would say that based on our own EBSD work, there's very little evidence for grain scale plasticity anywhere in this arc section. So point being, taking ideas off the shelf that are robust for the mantle, such as grain boundary processes or plasticity, is not appropriate in terms of thinking about rate laws or constitutive equations in this setting. The pore space reduction that is producing the cumulates seems to reflect a lot of local shearing. And I don't mean tectonic shearing. I mean, it seems like the system, as it's assembling itself and the mushes form, are being re-intruded and shearing themselves. And that's reflected in the fact that kinematic indicators are almost chaotic as you move from what was a small mafic mushy Pluton to another one. There's very little continuity in fabric. The fabrics are forming in response to local events. There's also no evidence for a simple top-down crystal static dynamic control. What this leads me to is that when we think about kind of a canonical model for magmatic applications, it's important to recognize that maybe the arc system process is going to be very different from that we would invoke for the layered mafic intrusion system, and that might be different yet again from when we might think of for the ocean islands, say under Kilauea. So my only point is that the geologist the geology needs to direct the modeling in terms of its philosophy and design, so that at the end we can create knowledge that really adds to the power of explanation. So what controls the behavior of mush? Really it's hard because these plutonic examples are not living. We're looking at them after they're they solidified. We can't assess the textural delicacy or really learn in a progressive way from those examples. Well, here's an example of a living mush. This is a thin section of the Fish Canyon tuff. Most of us would be comfortable thinking of that as an erupted melt-present batholith. And you look at this, it's a mess. It's a remarkable unit in its own right. We can't go into that. But just looking at this very crystal-rich system, is this what a mush is? Is this how we should think about a mush? Well, looking at this same thin section, if one just goes in, and I did this very quickly, there's many more than I called out. And these green dots indicate places where crystals are touching. And of course, in 3D, there's going to be a lot more of it. What we see is this is actually an incipiently granular system. This is not a fluid system, a fluid system where all the crystals are separated and the dissipation is largely driven by the fluid phase. What this is telling us is that the physics of the system is going to be dominated by the interplay of both pore pressure, viscous drag, and granular processes. And the more we look at the textures in detail, the more this becomes apparent. So, again, getting back to this beautiful melt-present xenolith from the Galapagos. So when we think about, what can cause motion in a mush? Well, there's three ways to induce motion. You can have shearing from a boundary, and this is expressed obviously in regional scale fabrics in plutonic rocks. The Tuolumne has 2 or 3 of these fabrics. Patterson and his team have written a lot about that and mapped them out. But you can basically have traction from a boundary, but that's a very difficult way to move your melt out because that's a very slow process relative to some of the time scales of melt extraction that have been proposed. You can also get shearing from reintrusion of other materials, and so that's the examples we just saw from the Famatina. Another way to get motion in a mush is to have internal gravitational collapse or internal fluid drag. By that I mean crystal-rich plumes, or perhaps fluid seams becoming buoyantly unstable, like the recent work by Allison Rust looking at Rayleigh-Taylor instabilities of melt seams. But the point being, here is another way to induce motion in your mush, but this is also going to be, once again, local. You can also have externally imposed pressure and drag by reintrusion and open system processes, producing what we might call unzipping. When I look at the extent and thoroughness of mixing in many systems, it seems inevitable that this has to be the dominant way that mixing takes place, thorough mixing, such that we have a mush, a silicic mush, that can then basically undergo unzipping, be fluidized, circulate, respond, whether you have resorption or growth or both, and then go back down to being a mush again. Requires a perturbation on a scale that's shearing from a boundary or an internal process. Just doesn't seem capable of producing. But these are the kinds of questions we can address with modeling, hopefully. But you might look at this picture and say, hey, wait a minute, that's way too crystal rich. That's locked up. That's jammed. We all know that, things lock up at 50% crystals, right? Well, I hope if nothing else, you leave here today, putting that idea, at least with a little bit of a blinking yellow light. The concept of a critical melt fraction has become an obstacle to progress because it's simply, there are too many times when the study of natural examples does not recover that result. Lockup or jamming, or the lack thereof, can occur at a range of solid fractions. And it's clearly not a simple question of packing and volume constraints, because you have both steric controls, which is volume exclusion, as well as the onset of friction at particle contacts, which gives rise to force chains, which is the fact that force is distributed very heterogeneously in granular materials. It's not uniform. And so when we think about this idea of force chains being the load-carrying elements within a system, it's an open question what turns them on or off. And I'm going to have to move past that now. I'm going to jump over this slide. We don't need it. But what I want to do is leave you with the appreciation that the idea of the constitutive behavior of a mush is not well posed. It involves a delicate balance between the strength of a particle network and the redundancy of the particle network. It isn't simply the volume fraction. It depends on the shapes of the grains. It depends on the orientation, the pre-existing fabric relative to the direction basically the axes of the stress tensor. And so this invites us to think about strength as being a network property. And this is something I'm exploring more now, thinking of the response of a mush in a kind of a network type of framing. Now, how do we go about dealing with these multi-phase flow observations? There's a number of theories available and modeling approaches one can use. I'm not going to go through all of them. They go from the simple, which was kind of the old school because we didn't have computers and we didn't quite have the theory, to more complex. The one I'm going to show you examples from is what we call the Eulerian Lagrangian. The fluid is modeled as a continuum. The particles are modeled as particles. You can have also Lagrangian, which is kind of the gold standard, more highly resolved. Jenny Tsoukalis' group at Stanford, for example, does a very nice job with more highly resolved methods. But still, the idea being you are looking at the particle-specific behavior, not treating the system as a mixture, as a fluid, and ignoring the granular frictional interactions. So I'm going to show you a quick example of this. This is work we started back in 2015. Some of you have seen this before, and that's fine. Once again, I know I was encouraged not to show new works. I'm going to show this stuff because basically it's sufficient for purposes of demonstration. We did a model where we just looked at a layer of olivine. That's the colored stripes are just there for visualization. We have a layer of olivine. We created it by letting it settle in a basaltic melt. It's whatever the porosity is, it's the one that was created naturally by the settling process. And then we intruded it from below with new pure melt, just asking the question, the simplest question you can ask if you want to look at mixing in the simplest system, olivine grains. We're just going to inject you with pure melt and ask what happens. Now, the advantage of this approach is because each particle is being modeled independently, One does not have to invoke ad hoc assumptions about the material behavior. It's all resolved. If the particles come into frictional contact, they have friction. If there's enough energy so they collide, they have collision. The fluid particle interactions are simply drag. There is no suspension viscosity in this, okay? And so the nice thing is it's very simple in that way. It's F equals ma, that's it. This one doesn't have heat transfer, others that we do, but that is the beauty, that by having that simplicity, one no longer is left wondering whether their assumptions on suspension viscosity are really appropriate or not. We already know from looking at natural examples that there are a lot of expressions of non-continuum behavior out there in localization. We want to allow our systems to find that if it is appropriate to understand their behavior. And this is an approach that allows that to happen. So I'm going to show you what happens when you simply intrude melt in the bottom. And you're also going to get to see the force chains when I run this little movie. This is going to look something like this. Here's our same pile. It's the very same pile. Now what's color contoured is for all, 10 to the 5 crystals in here, the brightness is simply the amount of force relative to the mean force being transmitted at that particle-particle contact, okay? So I'm going to start that movie now, and I'll talk a little bit. Here comes our new melt. It's white. So you can and the existing melt, basaltic melt within the pores is black. So by looking at any color change there, you're looking at mixing phase and the introduced one. Down here, one can see the fluctuating state of the granular media. It's basically completely fluidized here in the middle. We call this the mixing bowl because there are no grain-grain contacts. Hence, there is no force being transmitted between them. I just got a message saying my internet connection's unstable. I hope I'm still live. Okay, for the interest of time, I'm going to stop this now, but you can see the kinds of information that one can extract from this. How do we know that's recovering anything in the natural record? Well, one prediction a model like that makes at the particle scale is that there's going to be some force expended, of course, between two particles in contact. In this basically bed of olivine, do we see that? How would we know that? How do we possibly validate something like that? Well, this is a really, really nice paper by Penny and her co-authors that came out last year looking at doing EBSD on lattice distortions within kilowin olivines. And they proposed that, in fact, the memory of particle-particle contacts is preserved within these olivines and can be revealed by doing EBSD measurements. In addition, when we go back to our field examples and ask, well, how good a job is this doing in recovering this kind of very localized type of observation? Well, the simulation I just showed you did that beautifully. We created small local internal melt present faults and truncations, just as observed in the natural rock record. Then in closing, I'm just going to say the next step is it's like somebody tried to send me a chat. Here's our nearly closing slide. Where are we going with this? The next step is doing fabrics of fabrics. Alex is working on non-spherical particles under very, very mushy conditions with viscous melts. We want to understand better the evolution of a polydispersed crystal cargo. We want to look at crystal zoning and do statistical studies, better understand mixing styles and timescales. And we're on the verge of being able to do 100 million particles, 100 million crystals in a simulation within the next 5 years. So as I said at the start, this is a very exciting time in developing the notion of a modeling collaboratory, especially if it is explicitly linked at the outset the conversation between people doing lab experiments, people looking at field examples and doing microtextural and microchemical analysis, and people trying to advance the cutting edge in numerical methods in multi-phase flow. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Yay.
George.
All right, well, we're going to move on to just purely George questions. So I know there's a lot of leftover for Tom, but just in the interest of time. So the first question we have for you, George, is from Luca Crigi again. And how fast do you think melt can be extracted from mushes? And can melt be extracted even syneruptively?
That's a great question, Luca. And I've really kind of avoided looking at the volcanic question because of the possible role of volatiles may play a very big role in melt extraction, and, you know, anywhere from 2 kilobars on up, or maybe 3 kilobars on up. We're still working on the how fast. Certainly fast enough. For example, in the case of, Tom showed us some time scales from volcanic systems. And in the case of Famatina, we know that entire arc section was built in less than 4 million years. And the recent paper by Klan and Yaguts on the Big Bear system in the Southern Sierra said the arc section there was built in only 2 years. So pretty darn fast.
All right, next question is from Michael Dungan. Was your Fish Canyon picture tuff or Pagosa Peak dacite? If so, I would argue that the broken, scattered, and re-amalgamated crystals in the tuff are a distant sample of Fish Canyon magma. Sorry to be fussy.
Well, you are fussy, and I don't know the answer to that. I'll have to go back. It's one of those images I grabbed from one of your papers so long ago that I don't remember which one.
I think it's tough.
Could be.
And it looks very different. I think that's why Sturmer and Whitney failed to understand what they were looking at when they did their studies of Fish Canyon. You didn't see the textures and grain size relationships in the Pagosa Peak dacite, which is really a piece of magma. Sorry about the fussiness.
We go way back. It's all right.
Okay, our next question comes from Tobias Keller. Thanks for the great talk. Granular scale direct simulations, as helpful as they are for connecting processes to data at the same scale, will remain limited to around meter scale for a while. For crustal scale processes, we will need to use some flavor of mixing continuum models. How do you see the two approaches inform each other in the future?
Well, that's something we should. That's a great question, and that is the $64,000 question. Even if we can do 100 million crystals, we're still looking at trying to do proof of principle work in support of field observations rather than ab initio magma chamber scale type simulation. And there's an important place for that. This is, everybody's trying to figure out the upscaling, and the challenge is, as well, Tobias, because you've been a leader in trying to develop homogenization processes for developing continuum models from complex multi-phase flow. The real challenge is the anisotropies between the stress and strain tensors are really difficult to predict. In the engineering case and pipe flow, yeah, you can do it, but in our simulations where we have basically open flows where you can transition from with the viscous or inertia number can range in a single event from granular close packed to fully fluidized, and then how to have a constitutive dial that captures all that. I don't have the answer, but I do appreciate your point.
Thanks.
All right, next question from Meredith Calogero. How long do these crystal force chain simulations take to run, and what programming language are these models being developed in?
Well, each group has a little bit different approach to their programming. There's different ways to do them. The more resolution you get, the more time you have to spend. The ones I showed you took a couple of months. And that is a, and those are not the kind of results that are as resolved as the ones, for example, Jenny and her team are doing, which take a long time as well, but you do fewer crystals, but you get better resolution. So it depends on the question you're asking. But in terms of computer languages, I still use Fortran 90 because you can parallelize it in a heartbeat, and my grandmother can read it, unlike C++. But it just depends on what's going on. Nowadays, I mean, a lot of times you'll have a Python wrapper around the front end, and a lot of that is hidden from view, frankly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, our next question is from an anonymous attendee. So thank you for your talk. How can geophysical observation, seismicity, deformation help validate or be compared to these models?
Well, most geophysical observations are kind of in the long to medium wavelength in their resolution. And, Alex is now working, in fact, on trying to develop a model for sound speed in crystal mushes using DEM-CFD. But it's hard because the wavelengths of resolution in most geophysical techniques are much larger than the scale we can handle with that approach. So currently, not much. There isn't much marriage of the geophysical scales with the DEM resolved results.
Another anonymous question about modeling. How much can the inclusion of effects such as conduction affect the dynamics of modeling?
Sure. Well, we've done plenty of simulations with heat transfer. It just takes more time because you have another step where you have to solve a scalar equation for the heat transfer, and it has to be, we normally ignore radiation, but you have to ask each crystal, are you touching another crystal? If so, how long have you been touching? What is your conductivity? And what is the putative area of that contact over which that heat transfer is taking place? Generally, because we try to show dynamic ones, most of the heat transfer is taking place between the melts and the particles, not so much between the particles. We kind of assume the particles all start out live, the crystals all start out live at the same temperature, but then get tossed into an incoming melt that's hotter or colder and then respond. And so most of the time we're estimating a boundary layer thickness for advective heat transfer rather than conduction, but we do include that.
Thanks.
Okay, I don't know if it's allowed, but Tom has a question and he says he can't put it into the box. So I was gonna let Tom ask a question. If he can. Show.
Is that okay? Yeah, all right. What do you think the effect of including bubbles would be? And the reason I ask that question is that in the Sierra one sees mafic Schlieren, and it's hard to conceive how those little hornblends and biotites and magnetites so efficiently separate themselves from viscous granitic liquid. And I've always wondered whether bubbles would help. So I don't, we always want you to model more things, but what's your opinion?
Bubbles. Well, what makes bubbles hard is because they don't have a fixed shape and they're compressible. And now you have to deal with a phase that, I don't have rules to predict what its shape is going to be. We did try and model bubbles where we just assumed they were going to be spheres. And I was expecting it to be very exciting. In fact, we did a simulation just like the one I showed where we loaded it up with 30% bubbles. And I thought once that thing unlocked, it was going to flush, literally. What happened was, though, because of the viscous drag, the melt phase grabs that bubble. Only a few of them were actually able to escape and get to the, leave the system. Most of them were just following the fluid around. And that was kind of disappointing, but I thought, well, of course, the drag is high enough. But then I wasn't allowing the bubble to change shape. We also did one where we attached bubbles. We put in pseudo magnetite grains or oxides, I should say, and attached bubbles to those. And see if that change, helped. Just as you were saying, we do see, like even tiny zircons seem to be getting separated. And it did help a little bit on those, but the bubbles kind of like, I just thought, I can't make much progress. I want to make progress on the things that I think I can understand and is robust. And so I know Chris Huber wrote a number of papers on looking at bubble flow in static mush, using a lattice-Boltzmann method, which is another high-resolution method. But I'm kind of staying away from bubbles for now.
All right, we have a question from Chiara Montagna. Do you think there might be problems of undersampling? That is, the relatively few samples we are able to collect and analyze may be too few to encompass a variety of processes and inform models?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. This is a pet peeve of mine. We just had a paper appear in Contributions with Fidel Costa, where what he did was he took those same simulations I showed you, and we started random sampling them at different points of time and saying, since we know the story, we know the mixing time, we know the mixing amounts, we want to see if I just started with the crystal cargo, and we assume some simple laws for growth or resorption, and I sample this, how much do I have to sample before I get the answer that I know is in there? And it was a little humbling. You need to sample a lot, depending on how much confidence you have, because some of those crystals are swimming around and they don't even know that there's been a temperature change. Others are in the meat of it. And if you just erupt that on the surface, how do you know which of those you're getting? And so one direction we're going with this is doing studies and building on what we did with Fidel is just like we had synthetic seismograms, right? You create a numerical earthquake and you look at the ground response. We can do this. We can do synthetic mixing events where we look at the response, the diversity of responses in the crystal cargo, and have a better idea about the statistical requirements. We'll never be able to measure enough, right? That's just a fact of life. But at least we'll be able to have an idea about what enough might be and roughly where we are with that.
And if I may add something, this also may be linked to the question of the size of the system we're looking at, as Tobias was saying earlier, right? So you focus on a part of a system that is actually much, much larger. So you kind of try to be able to understand everything, but it's harder than it seems. Okay, thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
All right, so we're going to move on to our last question to respect the fact that we are approaching the end of our time. So our last question is going to be from Adam Kent. George, I completely get the idea of a single critical fraction for remobilizing a melt is an oversimplification, but the fact remains that erupted magmas with more than 50% crystals are quite rare. Is there also a process that separates crystals from liquid during subsequent flow or after mobilization?
Well, this is a great question, Adam, and thank you for that. It was my advisor who first came up with one of these ideas in his landmark contributions paper. I think that the stuff that gets erupt can erupt. When I'm thinking about mushes, I'm thinking that's kind of the stuff that doesn't erupt. But even within that I guess what I'm saying is what the triggering and the evolution of an eruptive event is kind of, I think, an extreme shock to a mush. And when we think about more what controls mush behavior during internal differentiation processes and reintrusion processes, that may be where the 0.5 is an underestimate or isn't an appropriate. 0.5 may be the right jamming for eruptions, but it may not be an adequate one-size-fits-all for describing a lot of the other in the mush realm type behavior. I hope I'm making some sense here.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, George. And yeah, I mean, I was thinking along the same lines. I mean, we've all had those classic examples, say, of segregation of crystals and liquids in a dike, where you can see that happening from flow. Is that a process we need to consider? This, and this is post mobilization of the mush. But I guess what I'm getting at is whether the stuff that gets to the surface, kind of like the fish canyon, does it still contain that much information about the actual mush, or has there been sort of some post flow related processes that have sort of obscured that information?
There may well have been, and this is something, it's just so hard to know. I think one of the targets that we're going to hopefully move towards with some of the Patterson rig work is get a better idea on the nature of jamming. What is this actually in geological materials? I mean, the 0.5 is a terrific kind of an observational, threshold, but what is it really in jamming? And I know Kathy's looked a lot, Kathy Cashman and her team looking at clusters. Crystal clusters are kind of, I think, telling us something about the maybe something about the nature of the mush prior to, its disturbance prior to eruption, and something I want to pursue with this network approach. But this is all new frontier stuff. Really asking new questions of the crystal cargo, not just chemical questions, but mechanical questions. And of course, the most daunting thing is trying to learn how EBSD works. That's
Great. Thanks for a great talk, George.
Welcome.
Okay, I was informed to let everyone know that any remaining questions that haven't been answered will be forwarded on to our speakers today in the hopes that they will potentially respond to them. But with that, I think I should transition this back over to, I don't know, Kyle, Helge, who wants it?
Okay, I guess it's me. Thank you all for attending today's webinar. First and foremost, thank you so much, Tom and George. That was great. Reminder, we have another webinar at 12 noon Central Time on Thursday, and then the planning meeting on Friday. If anybody's interested to contribute to the planning meeting but can't attend, please go to the MCS Volcanoes workshop webpage, where also the registration for webinar and planning meeting are. There will be a form where you can submit your comments, questions, suggestions, ideas, and we will take them into consideration during the planning meeting. Thank you all very much. Panelists, please check your email if you want to join for a brief post-webinar meeting. There will be a separate Zoom link that I'll be sending in a minute. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for listening and asking interesting questions.